So I want to now talk about the effects of tariffs, and this is looking at a page from the Brookings Institution. And so you can see is that there are a number of tariffs that were put on imports. So let's talk about what the effect is of imports. If the US were just making everything it consumed by itself, I'll call that situation autarky. This means that we're not trading with anyone, okay? So if you are trading, what it means is that if somebody in another country is able to produce the good at a lower cost than somebody in America, and when we say cost, we assuming competitive markets, that's not always true. It's not true in a lot of industries, but we're going to assume that right now. That means they're pricing at cost. If somebody else in another country is producing at a lower cost, consumers in the US can get that at a lower cost, okay? And so under President Trump, there was an increase in tariffs on solar panels, washing machines, steel, aluminum, and a lot of other products. The US government got $79 billion in tariffs, okay? So we're going to look at the effects of tariffs, and we're going to start off looking at that. I just want to kind of summarize. We're going to say it created several thousand jobs in certain industries, in particular steel, which we're going to end up talking about. But as you create protection in one industry, one of the problems is that is just no free lunch here. This is coming at a cost, and it comes at a cost to the consumers, which we're going to see. And for every job created, we actually we lost out. So what is the cost that consumers paid more? The higher price attributed to tariffs for every job created. Wow. It seems like for every job created, right? So what does that mean? We should look back at how many jobs were created here. Several thousand jobs were created in the steel industry. And each of those jobs cost American consumers $817,000, okay? So what does it mean that there are cheaper ways to do this, cheaper ways to save some kind of job or to give people jobs? I bet you those jobs that were obtained did not pay like almost $1 million, okay? And so what's the cheaper way to help people? All right, so let's actually look now at the effect of tariffs, and we're going to talk about some of the things that are in that article. So let's first assume, and this is not an unwarranted assumption, that in many cases the US firms are not lower cost than their international compatriots, so they're internationally inefficient. So we have our usual demand and supply framework, and we'll talk about in a moment. We'll talk about we're going to talk about steel. So let's talk about the steel industry here in the US, and demand and supply curves. I'm ignoring elasticity, just kind of want to make the points. And so law of demand is downward sloping, law of supply, it's upward sloping. And as we've seen, that's coming from an assumption of diminishing marginal returns, which means that the marginal cost curve is going to slope upwards. It's based on the marginal cost curve. Our demand is keep kind of hammering this home. It's the marginal benefit. The benefit of each additional unit is less and less, similar to our diminishing marginal utility. Okay, so now if the US does not at all have any kind of trade in the world, then what happens is we've got this price here. Let me this price. Oops. Yeah, let me undo that. Try to pick my drawing tool. Okay. Our price would be here, right? And this is, I'll call that our P star. That would be the domestic equilibrium price. But in the case of steel, the US imports steel, which means that people in the US buy steel from other countries, all right? And so now we're going to insert that if Americans are buying steel from other countries, that means that they must be getting a better price than from the domestic firms. And so there is a price that you can buy from on the world market, and it's lower. And so what's the problem with this from the point of view of some government official? The problem is that it costs jobs. Specifically, let's go back to our specifically here. Let's when you go from Q star, I call this QS2, right? And I'm going to call this, if I go across from the world price to the demand curve, we have people in the US buying more than is supplied by people in the US. And so go over to the demand curve, it's QD2. Oops. And let's label our price over here, just call it PW. So what's the problem? The problem is that if the production, domestic production falls from Q star to QS2, this is not a fictitious thing. This is something that's really happening. People lose their jobs. And a lot of those jobs have been blue collar manufacturing, family supporting kind of jobs, and people do really lose those jobs. Okay. So what was the effect of that when we had looked at this earlier? We had an increase in consumer surplus, and I'm going to put this in with an annotation here. Let's see if I can annotate my own. I think I can't quite do that, but let's try to get some kind of thicker. Okay, I'll get a thicker line here. What happens is the consumer surplus increases with trade from this area here all the way to this area here. So some consumers who didn't have access to the product before now have access, and then we've got these area here that is a lower price. It used to be partially producer surplus that now becomes consumer surplus. But what happens to producer surplus? Producer surplus goes from this area here, everything below the price that they would receive without any kind of imports goes to this smaller area here. But in that happening, not only is this industry less profitable, so remember producer surplus now has been defined as your total revenue minus your variable cost. It happens when production declines, people lose their jobs in this particular industry. Okay, so this industry is steel. So important thing about steel is that it's an input into other businesses. And I'll give some examples of that. Steel used furniture. I don't like it myself, but people seem to like it. one of the big industries that uses steel, it's the office furniture making. I'm not sure if container ships use steel, I think so, but check on that. So what happens when a tariff is put on steel? So let's put a tariff on. So what's a tariff? A tariff is a tax, but only on imports. So when you buy, we've talked about the effect of a tax. Taxes raise the price to the buyer, lower the return to the seller. But what happens if this is the world price, PW, and then a tariff, a tax is only put on the imports? So if I'm a consumer and I was paying PW, now imagine that the government puts a tariff on it. That means, let's put the line in here. Put an orange line. Now, remember, this is a competitive environment, so tariff is going to go on. That the world price is going to be, again, we assume competitive markets, not always true, but that's our starting point and benchmark. They're already driven down to costs. Now they're going to have to charge, they can't take the hit in the in terms of the tariff. They're just going to have to charge any consumer. So whereas before you could get PW, your steel for PW, if you are a office furniture making business, or imagine you make containers for container, for shipping containers. Now you have to buy it and you have to pay this tariff. And in this case, the consumer is actually going to be paying it. But what happens if you're an American company? If you're an American company, you don't have to pay the tariff. So you used to have to compete as a company with PW, that lower cost. And if you couldn't compete, if you were higher price, nobody was buying from you, you would have been shifting your resources. You would have been cutting back in the short run on hiring people to produce, because the cost of production, you couldn't recoup that in terms of the price. And so now, let's go, you get a little bit higher price that you have to compete, and you no longer have to compete with PW. To compete with PW, puts tariff. So with the tariff, you can hire more people, right? So this is the job preservation aspect of tariffs. You allow people who have a higher marginal cost than the price that they would normally be able to sell the product for in a competitive market. You essentially eliminate some of their competition by giving them some kind of wiggle room. These people are internationally uncompetitive. They cannot actually charge a price that covers the price that customers are willing to pay for the product, and so they wouldn't normally produce it. But now you've given the foreign company now has to compete with not only whatever their cost of production is, but the cost plus the tariff. Okay, so what happens to QD? We go across from the price with the tariff, and we go down from the demand curve there. See my kind of rotating, that should be, oh dear. All right, so let's go to our text. So imports is the difference between what people are able to buy, willing and able to buy, and what the domestic producer sells. It goes from QD2 minus QS2 goes to QD3 minus QS3. So imports shrink, right? When imports shrink, they're shrinking for two different reasons. These are new imports with tariff. Shrinking because more is being made in America, but it's also shrinking because people are losing access to the product. So in terms of people who think about the impact on the steel market, Let's actually talk about what's happening on the steel market. Not the steel market, the office furniture market. Think of container ships. Office furniture. This is steel office furniture. Think about what else uses steel. Supply, demand. And what happens when the cost of an input goes up? Well, what happens is that I no longer cost me this. This is the marginal cost now. Let's think of the cost, our marginal cost calculations when we have the price of an input going up. Just imagine like our wages, well, supply curve shifts to the left, or it's a higher cost for each and every unit. And so the price of the products that are using the input will go up, okay? And so what's happening is we're preserving some jobs here, but what's happening is consumers are paying higher prices. So what did we lose in consumer surplus? We lost A, B. I'm going to label every area here, but just to note that this area here is really can be identified as one. We lose this area of consumer surplus. Where does it go? Who does it go to? A goes to an increase in producer surplus. It's increased profitability by firms who are already producing. And it gives some people essentially their jobs back. They are uncompetitive without a tariff. They cannot charge enough to recover the costs. But if you remove some of their competition, you remove some of the imports, what ends up happening is that then the price gets bid up again by consumers willing to pay a price that is not quite the pre-trade price, but with the tariffs, consumers are still willing to pay them. What's going to happen is, of course, it's going to be a tariff revenue. The tariff revenue is going to be the per unit tariff. It's like a tax revenue, but it only applies to imports. It's imports times the per unit tariff. And so even as we increase jobs in the steel industry, what's happening here is consumers decide that they're not going to buy as much office furniture from US companies. What's going to happen then is those people in those industries are going to lose their jobs. Okay, so we benefit people in one industry, but it comes to the cost of the other. The other thing that happens with tariffs is usually the other country retaliates. They may not even retaliate in an area that is in the same industry, right? It's not, maybe not in the same realm. They retaliate in some way against a product that the US is exporting. So they'll put a tariff on that, making that relatively more expensive. I'm going to make another point. Let's put here. Just want to note, we're going to have a deadweight loss, and it's going to come from here. The US used to be getting these products at a cost of PW. The cost now goes up to the supply curve for any units beyond QS2. If the imports are in a sense, as a country, you could have been paying PW for more imports. We're assuming competitive markets. We're assuming you could just kind of infinitely keep paying that amount. And for a long time, this has been true, that a lot of things could have been bought and almost this consistently low price. And it has kept inflation in the US low to keep these imports out. And so the prices are going up now, but it's reflecting that the US is paying essentially because it's making it itself and it's relatively inefficient. It's the country is actually paying a higher cost to get this product. Okay, so that's inefficient as a country. If you can get something for a lower cost, to pay a higher cost by making it yourself. It's inefficient in that sense. I want to point out tariff revenue. Let's change some colors here. This is the imports. Is this here with the tariff, and the size of the tariff is here. So this area, the tariff per unit tariff times the imports, that is the tariff revenue. Talk about one last area here. And let's change the color. That's E. This area is an area that we lose in terms of our consumer surplus. We lose that area because we no longer have access to the product. So when you think about what that is, the demand curve gives us a marginal benefit of additional units of the product. It's the benefit to people over and above the price they pay. So people are getting a benefit, and that benefit is, they're not paying for all that benefit. So you want to think about this as wealth creation. So what happens here is that they lose a certain amount of wealth that they had. They use value over the cost of what they're paying. Okay, so those consumers are poor in that sense. They may have to switch, if they're a company, they may have to switch to some other kind of materials that is more expensive, right? So think of it as maybe cost savings they used to get or something like that. So what's happening here is consumer surplus. What's the effect of the tariff? The effect of the tariff is going to be a decrease in consumer surplus of A, B, C, D, and E. So that loss to consumers results in an increase in producer surplus transfer to producers just of A. Then we've got tax revenue. So I'm going to call it government. Not tax revenue, I should be specific, a tax on imports. So B and D. And so is that we've got a bid of that loss to consumer surplus that doesn't get transferred to anyone. So the deadweight loss of the policies, the loss in surplus that doesn't get transferred to anyone, it's just lost to the economy, and loses B and E. Okay, and so when you have a loss that's not transferred to anybody, just kind of disappears from the economy, then this is the loss to the economy. Call that the deadweight loss. So the policy overall is inefficient. Some stuff that stays the same, I'll put this here, this F, G, H. I know label everything, you know, this triangle, I'll keep this triangle the same. All of this, these areas won't change. The producer surplus would originally have had an I, it's increased to A and I. The consumer surplus would have been the A to E, and then they added F, G, and H, and that F, G, and H remains, okay? And so we haven't completely eliminated imports, but the tariff makes the imports less competitive, preserves jobs in the steel industry, and then in the sort of follow-on market there, if the thing that you are trying to protect here in the US is an input into the manufacturing of other US companies, what you're really doing is making them even less competitive internationally than you would be. But we do preserve some jobs there. All right, so that's the effect of tariffs. Let me know if you have questions on that. Definitely read the articles to see what the actual costs are related to that.